Today we are going to discuss Bret Contreras' response to the study that was done on the hip thrust versus the squat by Barbalho and Gentil. When we look at this, the original study, if you didn't see the follow-up, it was a hypertrophy-based study comparing the hip thrust versus the squat. We will discuss a little bit of the protocol in this, but basically the results of that study, in the context that they were testing, it showed that the squat outperformed the hip thrust in overall hypertrophy of the glutes and the quads, where with the hip thrust, it didn't produce as much overall hypertrophy, but it was more glute dominant, which neither of those things surprised me at all. And I think, a lot of people, the conclusion that they came out with was that maybe this, says that, you should not ditch the squat, that you should do both things. I'm sure some people took it as a way of saying that like the hip thrust is not that good, etc. But really, when I look at it, it's more of this is a validation of principles. You can see our full response in how we talk about, the squat being a lengthened based and greater range of motion exercise. We would assume that if you put these two exercises under the protocol that these guys did, so they're basically being exposed to the same thing, that in terms of all-out hypertrophy, that the squat would be superior to the hip thrust. But that doesn't mean you should just squat or just hip thrust or not hip thrust. You should use both of these, in there, and you should use the right tool for the right job. And to elaborate on our points just a little bit is that I don't necessarily think either of these two exercises are my choice for what I would use in terms of like my best glute exercises in their respective categories. I do a different version of a hip thrust that is a smaller range of motion, less explosive from the bottom, more kind of a squeeze into the top, taking advantage of that rather than utilizing momentum, taking advantage of the fact that the exercise is challenging in that short position, and filling in a spot of the resistance profile that you don't get in a squat or a leg press or a lunge, et cetera, et cetera. And then in terms of the squat, I prefer a more stable environment if the goal is straight glutes. That isn't going to have as much load on the spine and low back or whatever. So if I will use the N1 bridge, as we call it, or basically it's set up like a hip thrust in that you are on a bench, but smaller range of motion, different tempo, versus the Bret Contreras style hip thrust. And I will choose probably a hip dominant leg press for my lengthened position or some sort of pull, but I mean, it's not that both of these exercises can't produce results. Like they both did produce results in this. Anyway, so in this response, Bret pointed out a bunch of things. We'll go through those points, trying to be as quick and as fair as possible. I will say that like in this, Bret did a couple things. One, in general, his flow of the paper is that the discrediting the study, period, not disagreeing with it or providing counter evidence, but more so disagreeing with the study on did it even happen, was it done properly, to the point where it's almost like that the data is false. So he has points for that. I'm not going to speak to anything that I don't know. So if anything like that happened, then that sucks. But what I will say is, prior to this study, my opinion, well, if you had asked me in this scenario, would the squat have outperformed the hip thrust, I would have said yes. So this study didn't necessarily change my opinion on anything with these two exercises, and I revert back to the fact that I would use two different things and use both things. And I think, to be fair, a lot of the people that Bret is quote unquote calling out or criticizing for their look at this study did give it a kind of didn't give it or use it as an excuse to poop on the hip thrust, but suggested as a final point that you should be utilizing both. You need to be training both. And in terms of the principles, greater range of motion and the different qualities of those exercises. And so I think because of likely some of the flack that he has gotten, he's been a little bit more antagonistic to the people that talked about this study or reviewed it or made an article or video on it than needed. I mean, I'm sure there's been a fair share of, flack his way. But that being said, if you saw our posts, we tried to be fair and just honest in the way that we train. So in terms of if the study is completely false and fake or whatever, and we could just throw it out, and you want to know what my opinion would be, it's still that, like, in this scenario, that the squat would outperform the hip thrust. And for a variety of principles, but that doesn't mean that you wouldn't be better off using both of them in some way, shape, or form and periodizing your volume in the way that you use them. Again, we can kind of get into that a little bit, or you can watch the older video. Trying to make this fast, so I'm going to force myself to move on. So the first point that he made on here was, did they do additional training in addition to this? And my critique of that statement is, yeah, that would introduce a lot of compounding variables, but would it necessarily change the message? So if we assume that all these people were doing other training, then what we're actually assessing is, if we added extra hip thrust versus added extra squats, what would that result have been? And so, I mean, even though, yeah, that is a less controlled study, and that, so you can nitpick that, it doesn't necessarily inverse the results in favor of the hip thrust because they, you know, if they had additional training. So in terms of trying to flip the argument or suggest the other way, that, you know, that doesn't really do anything for me. I mean, and to be honest, it doesn't change the story at all. He mentions the volume that they're doing, they're only doing 6 sets per week, and that maybe if they were only doing that much and they're well-trained individuals, they would have lost muscle size or strength, or at best maintained it. I would say, if you look at the intensity that they claim to have been using, meaning they're taking them to like close to failure, 6 sets to failure is a lot. Okay, how many of you guys, like, if you just take us, like, how many sets of actual failure do you do per week for a given muscle? 6 sets is a decent amount of volume that nobody's going to lose muscle or strength on. So, I mean, is it probably, like, is the total volume of, like, if you were just looking like sets, is that lower than what you would typically see in a program? Yeah, because, I mean, I don't know that I'm necessarily going to have somebody train 6 sets to failure of any single muscle group in a day or whatever it may be. So that, in a sense, there, you know, that, you know, it's not necessarily the most beneficial protocol. I mean, it's a brutal protocol, actually, like, when you look at that. Like, so that could possibly be one of the things that, you know, correlates with the result. Is like, yeah, the protocol is a little brutal. So, but it's not low volume when you look at the intensity as well. So to me, and again, it's across the board. So if we're looking at comparing the two, the fact that it's low volume, he's using that as a point of kind of critiquing, like, did the study happen, not necessarily saying that would have affected the results. And again, that's something that I'm not going to really speak to because I have no idea. He also brings up the ratio of the weight that the people used in terms of the hip thrust versus the squats, and that kind of correlates with his point of also saying that it was an inferior protocol for the hip thrust because of the tempo they used, and because of the frequency that they used it, right? So one, the way Bret does a hip thrust is it's more explosive from the bottom. You know, it's like explode up. And in this, it was a 2-second concentric, 2-second eccentric, so it controlled up and down. So when you look at the weights that people are going to be able to use using Bret's style of hip thrust, they're going to be much more because of the momentum they're able to generate from the more mechanically advantageous position. If you slow down that concentric, not only do you lose the momentum, all right, you also are adding to the fact that if these people are applying and exaggerating some intent with a purposely slow concentric, they're adding co-contraction and stuff in there that is drastically going to reduce the weight. So if I compare that to what I've seen using similar style tempos in the past, a 1-to-1 ratio is perfectly reasonable for the squat to hip thrust ratio. Now, if we go to explosive, then that's totally different, right? Like, if you allow me to thrust up from the bottom, I can definitely, do a ton more in a Bret Contreras style hip thrust than I can in a squat. But and I would see that across the board, right? Because, as Bret points out in here, he's trained and worked with a lot of people. So have I. And given those circumstances, those weights make sense given the tempos and also given the rep range and rest protocols that they ended up using. So if you want, and then when we get into the frequency of things, right? Like say, well, okay, hip thrusts don't produce as much mechanical damage, therefore he typically uses them 3 times per week. I think the goal of this study was to try and compare these exercises under similar conditions. And that speaks to the periodization model that he didn't like either, because they didn't train like the same rep range every week. What they did is like week 1, they did like 12 to 15 reps with very short rests, so like a metabolic style training. Then week 2, they did heavier 4 to 6 reps, so more of a neurological, like 3 to 4 minute rest period. Then they did kind of more of a high end hypertrophy range, 10 to 12 reps with 1 to 2 minutes in week 3. And then week 4, they did like 6 to 8, more of like the lower rep hypertrophy with 2 to 3 minutes rest. And then they rotated through that, at least is what I've gathered, right? So in a way, I mean, they're kind of periodizing the stress that they're putting these exercises through, the physiological stress of both load, rest intervals, and rep ranges. And I think the whole purpose of that, like if I hypothesize why they were doing that, right, would be to try and eliminate one rep range or one set of training parameters from favoring one side or one exercise or the other. So in a sense, they're trying to create as equal of a scenario as possible over this time frame for these exercises to shine, to really show if one is superior than the other within these parameters. So I look at that as like, okay, this is maybe not the way that you would particularly program somebody, is like having all that in there. It's not necessarily a worthless style programming. I'm sure a ton of people could get results doing that. We actually do something very, very similar in terms of we throw in periodic, like very metabolic stuff, and then do several weeks of more either strength or hypertrophy work to potentiate the benefits of all of the like sarcoplasmic hypertrophy and metabolic adaptations, glycogen storage and supercompensation, et cetera, all those things that you get. Now, I will say that within that, some of those ranges are probably going to preference one thing over the other. Like for instance, the weeks where they were doing like the 4 to 6 RM with 3 to 4 minute rest probably was not a very good week of stimulus from the hip thrust, just because of such a small time under tension and range of motion. For that. But again, then if this was on top of other exercises, then that buffers that out, etc. Either way, I don't think we can say that the way that they periodized the reps in any way would have resulted in a flip of the study, unless we purposely tried to design the study's training variables to favor the properties of one exercise over another, which that would be a valuable thing to say, like, okay, in this rep range or whatever, this exercise outperforms this, but if you change it, this one tends to be better or whatever. And you look at the comparison of those things. That's cool stuff to do if we ever get to that point in the research community, et cetera. But I mean, right now there's so much disagreement on volume and frequency and failure and significant reps or stimulating reps or whatever. Like, I think we're so far away from us, like the evidence-based community, accepting a training protocol as this is a good training protocol for this muscle group or this exercise or whatever, and so that's why we do that, and this one this, and being able to talk about how those two data relate. Most people just be like, oh, it's not the same, so it doesn't matter. We're just like, most people from a mechanistic perspective, they just aren't there to be able to have those conversations. So I think, in this case, you have to make things the same. You can't train hip thrust 3 times a week and squat 1 time a week and say, like, well, this means this one is better than that. The best in this context, you try and make them as equal as possible. Would it be cool to run another study with different rep ranges? Would it be cool to run a study where you train both of them 3 times a week and both of them 2 times a week and have all that stuff? Yeah, cool. More information is always going to be cool, but it doesn't change the results of this in the context that we see, right? So the next point that he talks about, and I will say that he puts a lot of stats and stuff in here in terms of the weights he uses in hip thrust versus squat, like hip thrust to squat ratio, and he did a poll on Instagram and stuff like that. But it's not the same exercise. Like it's not comparable to say a explosive hip thrust up and then compare that to the hip thrust to squat ratio when you're using a controlled tempo. It's just, I mean, you're not comparing. They're not comparable things in that context. So to me, throwing that stuff in there is kind of misleading and takes away a bit of the credibility of the argument, just because that in itself has a ton of faults in it, right? what is and then there was also then the total amount of loads they used, the amount of progress they made, et cetera, that goes into here, right? I think one person went from squatting in the 200s to like 275 or something like that over the 12-week period. And you know, Bret's like, I've never seen a high-level athlete do this or whatever. I can tell you that, yeah, I've seen stuff like that happen. You know, I've trained a lot of people, and that's, I mean, that's not normal progress, but you have to look at the scenario. Like if these are what we would call like trained individuals. So if you have a trained individual but wasn't doing a lot of squats, they were doing a lot of non-squatting work. Say they were doing a ton of hip thrust and a ton of like, you know, little bandy glute exercise and things or whatever. So they'd accumulated some tissue in their lower body. But they would have no coordination in the squatting movement. And all of a sudden you have them start squatting. That squat's going to improve like really fast. So what would be cool is to see that over time, because what we would likely to see in that person is that the first couple weeks they jumped up a significant amount, and towards the end of the 12 weeks we would see those strength gains drop off, right? That's data that I don't have access to. But it's not implausible for somebody to go from 205 to 275 pounds in a squat in 12 weeks if they haven't been squatting. So just because they've been training doesn't mean they've been squatting, especially if they've been accumulating a lot of hypertrophy but not doing that particular like motor pattern. Okay. So did that skew the strength results or whatever? Sure. But I mean, in the end, like, I don't think anybody really freaking cares what the strength results were. But the strength numbers, if there are numbers in here that do raise some skepticism, it may be the total amount of load that these girls could squat was a lot. Okay. But I don't know, right? Like, I don't know. It's not impossible. But if you were going to say something about this seems a little fishy, I would say the most fishy thing is, man, these girls were strong. But I don't want to say that like that should be discredited or whatever, right? You know, it's like, oh, there's not that many strong girls. I don't know how they were picked, select, etc. So, if you were going to be skeptical about one part of the data, I think that would be the part that I'm the most skeptical of, right, is just simply the amount, not necessarily the amount of progress that they made, but more so the total amount of load that these girls were squatting on average. Okay. Another point, and we brought this up as well, they did use knee flexion, 140 degrees of knee flexion, which is a deep squat, you know, for most people, and I would have standardized it for hip flexion. But if anything, I think if you standardized it for hip flexion, it would have only improved the glute hypertrophy results versus standardizing for knee flexion, because some of them might have been getting like pelvic tilts and all sorts of other things going on, making the squat more quad dominant or more low back, etc. So if anything, if we standardize that squat better for hip flexion, maybe the total amounts of weight they moved changed or whatever, but in terms of the hypertrophy data, I would think we're only making it a better glute squat at that point in time. Because I mean, we're talking full range of motion in the squat for glutes. It's not about how much knee flexion, it's about how much hip flexion, right? Like simply bending more at the knee isn't going to have that much of an impact on the glutes. Okay. In terms of the other points on here, you know, if we want to talk about the protocol they used, etc., you could always make an argument for using different protocols to get additional data, right? Because that's always going to affect what happens. Like, so we have two exercises of very different qualities. One is a short position, one is a lengthened position. One has greater range of motion and more integrated tissues involved in the other, etc. So there's different systemic work, different neurological work, etc. So, you know, you could always argue that if we change the protocols, the data might start to change a little bit. Yeah, but then the question becomes how much and whatever, but that doesn't necessarily take away from what happened in the context of this paper or this study. So we can only speak to this and then try to keep everything in context, right? So in this case, they were comparing, trying to isolate these two things under the same conditions. And it's like, you put a gun to my head and say, look, you only get one of these exercises and you need glute hypertrophy with no other rules. I'm probably going to choose a hip dominant squat because it lengthens that muscle, greater range of motion, etc. That doesn't mean that's the best way to train. You're putting me in a restricted scenario. So making certain conclusions about programming from this that it's one or the other would be a poor statement. I think a lot of people may have jumped the gun to do that, but I think most of the people actually that, you know, that Bret antagonized in this article gave it the fair shake of like, you should do both. But maybe that like the hip thrust is not just like this like magical thing that like does, it's the only exercise you need or whatever. And that's not I don't think that's how Bret's programs are either. You know, it's tough because of the way this article is kind of worded and the amount of like branding drops in there. It kind of reads a little bit like an advert at times, which I think takes away from Bret's points that he's trying to make. He's throwing some stuff in there. I think this would have been better delivered if he would have stayed on point with discussing, you know, his critique of the study without necessarily bringing in other things that are possibly even less about, like the whole Instagram poll and stuff like that. I think bringing in really unofficial data while you're critiquing another set of data, I think that distorts the argument a little bit away from Bret's favor, and it's a little too personal towards this Barbalho and I forget the other guy's name, Paulo something. Sorry. But in reality, like, I wish it would have been a little bit more objective, but, you know, we all make mistakes. You know, when people, you know, when something happens, people attack us, whatever, which I'm sure Bret has been going through some interesting stuff since this has been released. A lot of people probably took this as a way or a reason to attack Bret. But, you know, I mean, when we really put ourselves out there, when we say something is like, this is the best, that's just a hazard of it, right? And you can't take it personal. Like, if anything, all you can do is continue to try and do things that support your argument, right? Continue to do more research and more things, you know, and provide more information. That's the only thing that you can really do, because anytime you have a strong opinion about something, there are going to be people that are going to attack that point of view. You know, and anytime there's a chance for somebody to, you know, provide evidence against that, that's just what's going to happen, okay? All right, so what else? Let's see here. Okay, so to get on the kind of the last parts of this, right? So a couple points that Bret makes towards the end of this is that, you know, he gets into the gains and stuff that he's made. I'm going to come back to that, but one of the points towards the end here is Bret states that the hip thrust has the highest levels of activation and tension, and then he quotes in something my colleagues listed below, including me, all fail to understand. And it can be performed frequently because it doesn't beat you up and is easy to learn. This greatly fast forwards the hypertrophy process. All right, so end quoting Bret there, right? We discussed why, you know, from an EMG perspective, there would be a lot of activation in a hip thrust, and it wouldn't, you know, we would expect to see that the higher level of activation there versus a squat. Now the tension thing, I don't know what he's basing that off of, right? If he's basing that off of the EMG itself, that's that just doesn't translate. The other thing to consider is that you can't, like, he goes on to say that you know, you can do the hip thrust more frequently, etc. If an exercise has the greatest amount of tension, right, it is not going to be the exercise that you are not sore from. Like, the exercises that produce the most tension are the exercises that you can do the less frequently when you're training. That, like, if we qualify and standardize for training to failure, etc., the exercises that produce the greatest mechanical tension are the ones that produce the most trauma. Okay, so very simple. Like, that can't be true. It can't be the highest tension, but also be an exercise that you can perform the most frequently. The highest tension exercises are the ones that beat you up the most locally, right? And then we can qualify tension. We're talking tendon to tendon, and we're talking sarcomere-based tension, etc. So that's the only statement in here where I'm like, dude, that's not, like, that contradicts itself there. Okay, like some of these other things, like, I'm with you, I see exactly where you're coming from. That one right there, you can't say it. I mean, no exercise for any muscle group that works the shortest range of motion is going to be the highest tension exercise. It doesn't mean those exercises aren't valuable. There's plenty of reasons to use those exercises for sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, for pre-exhaust, post-exhaust, motor learning, all sorts of beneficial reasons. They're not invaluable for hypertrophy just because they aren't the exercise of greatest tension, right? Especially when we actually periodize them properly and we program them properly. But to say that, you know, an exercise can't be usually, like if you were to look at like what exercise is highest on the EMG and highest tension, the EMG rating is going to have different things that are going to cause it to go up, right? And tension is not necessarily the only one of those by far. So for a lot of things, there's a lot of things going on mechanically that cause a muscle to have a greater amount of activity or lesser amount of activity because the leverage at the joint is changing, et cetera. The muscle length is changing, all sorts of different stuff going on. So that's the only statement where I just like flat out agree with it on a scientific perspective. The other thing that I'll flat out disagree with is the accusation that we are like, that our point of view is misogynistic because some women have claimed that like they get great results and we're ignoring their opinion or point of view, and it's like that has not that I mean that's a real like taking it to that level there, that's that was a very, very poor place to go, I think, in terms of that, right? I mean, I really wish this would have been more objective because I mean a lot of the points are valid discussion points. None of them necessarily give a reason to inverse the conclusion, but I think the main message that Bret was trying to do is he was trying to criticize the study to suggest that they probably like to the point that like he didn't think it happened. It was whatever, or the data was forged, et cetera, et cetera. And he does go through some statistics and stuff that I'm not even going to pretend that I have looked to that detail. Like he had a buddy of his run an algorithm on stuff to say that looking at the data is like, oh, it's too clean, etc. You can read that if you want. What I will tell you is that with or without the study, my point of view on the principles of these two exercises is that the lengthened position, more greater range of motion exercise is going to be better in for hypertrophy in this context of like you can only do one under these similar protocols, right? We're not comparing the best possible scenario for the hip thrust against the best possible scenario for the squat, which again I would think would result in a similar thing, but the hip thrust likely would have shined a little bit better than it did in this particular study. The main thing to take away: do both things, right? And then the principle of like lengthen-based exercises are going to be really good for myofibular hypertrophy. Doesn't mean they're the only thing, doesn't mean that's the only way you can do it, etc. This is where, really understanding the mechanisms of hypertrophy, program design, really understanding exercise qualities and exercise selection is huge, right? Especially understanding the mechanics aspect of it, because what we have in terms of like EMG data and stuff like that isn't necessarily going to tell you the whole story about all of these exercises out there and adequate comparisons if you don't understand the biomechanics to a great degree across that. And there's a whole lot of neurology that goes into this as well. But at the end of the day, you can like even the beginner can understand that like you need to train full range of motion in some aspect, right? For like the glutes, there's no way to train the entire range of motion in a single exercise. So you're never going to have a one exercise glute program. It's just obscene, absurd. The last nitpick I will have on Bret's response is he takes it to the point where he looks at the progress of the Miss Olympia bikini winners from 2010 to 2019, and it's very suggestive that basically like his hip thrust is the main reason that the bikini competitors' glutes have evolved over the course from 2010 to 2019. And I mean, if I'm looking at this picture, I don't even think that I don't think there's a linear trend in those glutes. But definitely, man, if you want to talk about confounding variables, like you look at a physique class when it first started and nobody knew what it was, et cetera. And all of a sudden then you're like, okay, people know what it is. People start adjusting their training, et cetera. Because, prior to bikini, like figure girls, like it wasn't the girl with the best glutes that won, right? So they started adjusting their training for a different type, right? So these girls were doing more glutes, period. They're doing more lunges. They were doing more split squats, more squats. Like a lot of them were using different training protocols or whatever, but just like the whole volume and frequency and like the emphasis of this type of training and de-emphasis of other types of training, like it evolved, like it evolves with the sport per se. So, I mean, if you just look at that picture, I mean, I can look at like the third picture in here. I'm looking at it right now, and I'm like, yeah, those are some of the best glutes on the stage right there, right? That might have been an Italian Mellow, right? That's, I think it was like 2012, probably in there, right? And as we go through, it's not like all of a sudden, it's not like every year the glutes got better, bigger, right? And at 2019, we have the biggest glutes ever on that stage, right? And you know, don't even get me onto like freaking judging bikini. I mean, if I'm looking at this and I'm evaluating the glutes, like I think some of the best ones in this picture are like the 2015. So it's like, what the hell have we been doing the last 4 years? That doesn't mean anything. There's so many things, and you know, the judges change every year, and we're not looking at the average, like of the 30 girls or whatever on stage. We're looking at what was just that one girl, and it could have been her face, her boobs, or her hip to waist ratio, whatever it may have been, right? I'd like to think calves are important in there too. You know, who knows? But, you know, Bret definitely deserves credit for having a massive influence on training, especially in like this class of athlete or whatever, right? Regardless of whether I agree or disagree with some of his information or whatnot, you have to give the guy credit for the amount of exposure and the impact that he has had, whether you agree with it or not. It's been huge. But to in the context of this article, to then throw this out there, you know, that kind of seems, it just takes away from it. So the main thing I got from this is there's definitely a few things that make this seem like that maybe we should be a little skeptical of some of the data, but I don't have the information or the skill set to say that this study is fraudulent. So a lot of the points that he made on here are kind of like, I can see how maybe there's a challenge in there. So there is kind of like, you know, there's a few points in here, but not much more than I could nitpick on a lot of studies. So when he gets down into like running the algorithm on the data and stuff like that, you know, I can't really speak to that. So I think the only way that we're really going to know for that is like somebody else has got to run an adjunct or a repeat of the study and see what kind of results they get, right? And maybe give us, you know, some video evidence, et cetera, whatever. But like I said, study or no study doesn't necessarily change my point of view on how I think the outcome would have happened. And, you know, there's some good points in here, but most of these points are meant for these things would be nice to have. This would be good for future research. That's the context that they should have fit in. So, you know, I sympathize for Bret in terms of, you know, the fact that he's probably taking a lot of heat right now because of the other paper. If this was a fraudulent paper, that's definitely sucks. But I'm not saying it is or it isn't. What I can say is that, you know, my opinion was not changed by this paper. This paper got a lot of exposure because in a way, I mean, the amount of attention this paper got, you know, Bret is the one to thank for that, right? So the amount of attention that he's getting, both positive and negative, from this comes from, you know, how much of an advocate he was for the hip extension and the claims that he made about it, right? And that's why, and, you know, and you have as many followers that he does, right? Then something like this happens. That's why it becomes such a huge talking point, right? If that wasn't the case, then this wouldn't be much of a talking point. So in a way, I mean, you kind of make your own bed at the end of the day with some of these things when you have strong opinions, and these things will come and go. And, you know, like I said, the best solution to this is to just to keep collecting more data. The only thing that's going to throw these results out, you know, likely is going to be is if they aren't reproducible, and, you know, if somebody tries to replicate this. I don't know any other way of saying for sure this didn't do it. I mean, maybe they have something with their math or whatnot that's a little bit more definitive, but, you know, ultimately it doesn't change the narrative of what should be happening, right? So I think if I give the article itself a grade, I would say it didn't do a good job of it had some interesting points in terms of the response, but I think it was too personal, too antagonistic, and brought in too much data that was open to just as many, if not more, holes or criticism than the original piece that he meant to criticize, right? I mean, if you're criticizing a paper and you pull your Instagram people that are doing an exercise differently than in the paper, and then use that as part of the conversation, it's a huge leap. So I think the way that some of these points went about in here kind of hurt the validity of those points. I'm not saying that they're invalid. I'm just saying that's what happens as you kind of read this. Anyway, Bret, there's my response. If you want to discuss it, happy to. Hopefully that was helpful.